the most important thing that we predict as animals is where to get food. So we have to be able to predict the place that food will be there in order for us to survive. Predators, what they do is predict where the prey will be. So a fish, like a shark, can't just sit still and waiting for the prey to come and find its jaw, right? The fish has to predict the motion of some other animal and swim to where that animal will be in the future in order for it to catch that prey. So in evolution, we begin as these animals that are just sucking water and filtering our food. But once we develop a jaw, then what we have to do is to not just suck things in, but go and bite things. And the requirement for biting means that something is going to be bitten, which doesn't want to get bitten, so it's going to move around. So we now have to predict things. And that's when the cerebellum develops. In animals like us, where we live in a social environment, other birds that live in social environments, then you need to not just predict things about food, but also predict things about each other, so that I know how I should interact with other people. And that ability to become a social animal is probably another stage of development in the cerebellum.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Wandering Thoughts. Today I'm joined by Professor Reza Shadmehr. Professor Reza, you are at Johns Hopkins University and you're a professor of biomedical engineering and neuroscience. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your area of expertise to begin with, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Happy to be here. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I was born in Iran a long time ago, before the revolution. And I was lucky to come to America when I was 14 years old. So this was all before the revolution. It was a different world. It was a different kind of time in America and in Iran. And so I was raised in America. I was raised in a little town in the western part of the United States. It's called Spokane in the state of Washington. And when I was in college, I was interested in the brain because I saw a show on TV that talked about the brain and how amazing it was and the things that can go wrong with it and things that happen that make people, fundamentally disabled. And I was interested in applying engineering tools, which I was learning in school, which had to do with systems and complex systems, to another complex system, which I thought the most complex system I think of is the brain. And so I went to my advisor at school and I said that, I want to take these engineering tools that we talk about systems and how do we apply it to something like the brain? And he told me, well, you have to go to graduate school for that. So I went to graduate school, and when I was there, I took a class on robotics, and I was really good at it. I liked the math. I liked the way we described the motion and control of systems. And what really struck me was that how hard it actually was to make a machine move, do simple things. And the physics of it was really complicated, especially if you add joints and you make it so that there are many parts to the robot. It really becomes complicated to control that system, which is why if you ever see a robot, there are lots of safety things around it because it might screw up and they're powerful. And I was really wondering, like, how is it that our brain that has this body attached to it, our body is far more complicated than the physics of a typical robot. And yet, we have no problem controlling it. It's so simple. And it's not just, us humans doing it. It's every animal that exists knows how to control its body. And some of those animals are just staggering in how beautifully they control their body. Like if you've seen a cheetah run, if you've seen a bird fly, you realize that it's, these are not trivial things. And I sail. And so, I know a little bit about how wind affects the the sails and how to control a boat, and you ever see a fish and how they swim in 3D, you realize it's not trivial. When you see a bird flying in wind, it's not trivial what they're doing. So anyway, going to grad school and learning about physics made me appreciate that, look, what our body does all the time, we take it for granted. Moving up and down the stairs, running across a field, swimming in the water, catching a ball. These are difficult things that we're doing all the time, and it's no big deal. And then, you see a person who's been affected by some disease that alters their brain. Maybe they've had a stroke, maybe they have Parkinson's disease. You see, all of a sudden, those normal everyday things become really hard to do. And it's really cool to, I don't know, to ask yourself, how is it that the brain solves these problems so easily just just by, the hardware that it has? And how do you study that kind of question? And it seemed to me that if you know physics and if you know a little bit about robots, you have an appreciation for why it's a hard problem. And therefore you would have some clue, like, how is it that the nervous system is solving these problems? And that's what I wanted to do.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, what are the transferable skills you got from engineering and that helped you understand how the brain works better?
You know, writing equations was probably the most important thing I learned. And what do I mean by that? Um, so let's take some results that you had. Maybe you have some biological result or some behavioral result or something that describes an experiment that you did. And I think what I learned is how do you write that result in something concrete, like an equation that describes what is it that you saw. And of course, maybe 90% of the experiments that we do, we can't represent it as an equation. But sometimes, you see something so clear that says, oh, that's what's the relationship between these variables. And maybe these variables are like neural activity, or when I give a drug, it affects some concentration of some molecule or something like that. And I think in grad school, I learned that, the power of physics was a kind of a thinking process that made us humans able to observe things in nature, but write it down as an equation. And that is really what allowed physics to become a field of science that you can rely on. You could build a rocket and go to the moon because of equations. and
Mhm.
and wouldn't it be nice if you had something like that also in describing the brain? And that's what I would say is the tool that I learned in grad school.
So, what are some examples of equations we have when it comes to the brain and the nervous system that, yeah, the fundamental?
Yeah, yeah. Let me describe some. I think one of the most interesting ones is regarding a process of learning and its relationship to a neurotransmitter called dopamine. So, machine learning is based on the idea that, say you wanted a machine to learn to play some game, chess, or maybe Go, or maybe a video game, an Atari video game or something. So the way machines are programmed to play those games is via a algorithm called reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning is basically the process by which you produce some sequence of actions, and then you store the states that you experienced. You move the joystick left, right, up, down, and you experience these states, and you store those states. And then at the end, you win or you lose the game, and then you have to now go back and assign value to those states. Are those states good or bad? And at the end, when you win or lose, you get this reward. So in biology, in the 1990s, Wolfram Schultz, who was at I think he was at Cambridge at the time, with Peter
Mhm.
Dayan and Reed Montague, they published a paper in Science where they showed that dopamine activity in the basal ganglia of a monkey, when it received reward, played the rules associated with reinforcement learning, meaning that if you wrote down what the dopamine response was to when the animal got juice, it got a big response. But then animal quickly learned that there was this light that went on, this state that changed, that then predicted that I'm going to get this reward. And so after a while, the monkey's brain, the dopamine system, didn't respond to the actual juice. It responded to the light, which was the state in which the value was learned to be greater. And so they wrote this down as an equation that said that what was being learned is the value of this state. And that was the reinforcement learning rule that uh, Sutton and Bartow had invented for reinforcement learning of machines. And so they wrote an equation that said this is how dopamine is responding to reward, which became the basis of our understanding of dopamine and then led to many discoveries associated with how we learn to associate value and make decisions.
Wow, that's a good example. A key thing that I wanted to comprehend today, as even the big picture, is how the brain relates to prediction, how the function of the brain, what does it have to do when it comes to error, and what it has to do with movement. So I don't know where the best place to start with this is, so I leave it up to you. But from my limited understanding, I understand these things are related, and I'm sure you can produce a nice narrative so we
Okay.
understand.
Yeah, I'm happy to give you some examples. Ultimately, the most important thing that we predict as animals is where to get food. So we have to be able to predict the place that food will be there in order for us to survive. And predators, what they do is predict where the prey will be. So a fish, like a shark, can't just sit still and waiting for the prey to come and find its jaw, right? The fish has to predict the motion of some other animal and swim to where that animal will be in the future in order for it to catch that prey. A bird of prey, like an osprey, like a falcon, if you see how they survive by predicting the motion of another bird in flight. So they're like this incredible missiles that are flying to catch another moving object mid-flight. And so if you look at the brains of these animals, compare them to a chicken, compare them to um, another land sort of dwelling forager. Those kinds of birds that forage on the ground, they have brains that are very different than a falcon, than a shark. What's the big difference between them? Well, they need a brain that can predict presence of something in the future, their motion of that prey. And so an ostrich, for example, has a brain that's very much like a chicken, very much like a small pigeon even, in that they don't need to make predictions about things that are moving and catching it mid-flight. But an osprey, a shark, a falcon has those requirements. So the fundamental difference between these brains of these kinds of animals, including us, is development of the structure called the cerebellum. So in evolution, we begin as these animals that are just sucking water and filtering our food. But once we develop a jaw, then what we have to do is to not just suck things in, but go and bite things. And the requirement for biting means that something is going to be bitten, which doesn't want to get bitten, so it's going to move around. So we now have to predict things. And that's when the cerebellum develops. The cerebellum becomes a structure that is highly developed in animals that need to make predictions for survival. And so the development of the cerebellum has to do with changes in the environment that make it possible for animals to basically become predators, eat other animals, and which then requires them to be able to make these short-term predictions while you're coordinating many actions. So, your jaw doesn't just take food, it also takes air. So you have to control, as I'm speaking with you, I'm controlling how my mouth moves, how my tongue moves, how air goes in and out. It's an incredible process of coordination that is taking place, and I'm not even thinking about it, right? Because I'm thinking about making sentences for you. So the cerebellum is the structure that was appears to have developed in animals that became predators, the ones that had to make predictions about where the prey is going to be. And then we think that in animals like us, where we live in a social environment, other birds that live in social environments, then you need to not just predict things about food, but also predict things about each other so that I know how I should interact with other people. And that ability to become a social animal is probably another stage of development in the cerebellum.
Wow. So this is very, very interesting. So when it comes to the cerebellum, does it create these representations? And for instance, when at the beginning of my year this year, when we were talking about the cerebellum, correct me at the bits I'm wrong. When I'm going to pick up my cup and I want to drink some water, there's also a representation of this that's kind of compared to what I'm doing, and we're seeing how much error there is between the two. Am I understanding this concept correctly? So where is this representation exactly? Like it's an abstract thing, but where is it stored? How does it look like? What areas of the brain are activated when this representation becomes occurs?
So the answer is we know just a little bit about this. And there are parts of the parietal cortex that represent objects that we interact with, particularly tools. Um, there are probably parts of the cerebellum that are involved in representing that object. We know that, for example, you can learn to manipulate things through practice. So if you keep interacting with an object, you get better at it. I'll give you a simple example. So if I show you a small saw and I
Mhm,
show you a piece of wood, you know that I have to hold the saw so that its edges are going to have to go this way so that I can, saw this piece of wood. But this is something you've learned because you know what a saw is and you know what to do with that saw. So that's tool use.
mhm,
Um, we know that when there's damage to parts of the parietal cortex, it results in a form of the deficit called apraxia, where the person doesn't know what a tool is. So, for example, if I were to show that patient that small saw on a piece of wood, they might not know about it this way. They might align it in this way because the ability to use the saw and know what the saw is something you've learned, and it becomes a memory that you can store. Same as a toothbrush. You know what a toothbrush is and how to use it. You know that the toothbrush is used for cleaning your teeth, not for combing your hair. But it could have been either of those, right? And this is something that we've learned because of our ability to use tools and understand its use. But we know that certain lesions in the brain make the individual so that they become, they don't know what this tool is called apraxia. Um, Now, in terms of the neural representation of these kinds of abilities, we know it mostly from these patient studies. And there's some work in other non-human primates, in monkeys, where monkeys have been taught how to use a tool. And then you look at the brain, you measure neural activity in various regions, and you see that I see. So when the hand is holding this tool in this monkey, the neural activity changed with respect to before. And maybe that's a representation of the tool. And
Mm.
most of this work is really still in the, we're just trying to understand how it works. Um, Not much more really, much more needs to be done about it.
When you say neural activity, is it that it's we do an EEG and electroencephalogram on the monkey, and or is it certain w waves
Right.
that
Right, right.
so
What does that mean? What does it mean
what does that look like? Yeah.
So there are multiple levels of neural activity, right? So at the sort of the gross level in terms of time resolution or temporal resolution and spatial resolution, you have something like fMRI. Then you
Mm,
have EEG, electrodes that you put on the skull. So these are non-invasive methods. Then invasive methods requires drilling a burr hole, going through the skull, putting an electrode in the brain and recording the neural activity, the voltages that the neurons are producing, because neurons are electrically generating biological systems. And so you can record the spikes that are being generated by these neurons. And then what's amazing is that, you know, if you look at if you measure neural activity in a bird, in a monkey, in a human being, you always get spikes, and the spikes are the same. So, the human being spikes are not different than let's say a spike in a bird that you might measure. And so there are neuroscientists that study these various different kinds of animals. Most of them focus on mice, but you can measure neural activity in the monkey brain, in other kinds of animals, and in humans. So in humans, it's done during neurosurgery, and they're just spikes. Then the problem becomes, what do the spikes mean? Because it's like what you're measuring is just like pop, 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 pop. Some neuron is firing. Sometimes you can record activities from many neurons at the same time. So then you can put together this not just one dimension of one neuron, but all these other dimensions that describe these other neurons and what they're doing. And so you have a small sample from this gigantic structure that is being involved in your task. And then the problem becomes, what's the relationship between these spikes and the behavior? So maybe the person is moving their arm, or the monkey is moving its eyes, or the bird is singing a song. So what's the relationship between these? And that's the problem of making sense of the brain.
mm, okay. So when it comes to memory consolidation, so I'm what I don't know. I'm throwing. I'm using a racket and I'm hitting a ball, and I'm playing tennis, and I get better at, predicting that, okay, now is the moment that I'm actually going to hit the ball and I'm not missing it as much. So w- when someone has apraxia, do they lose the ability of memory consolidation, if I'm understanding correctly?
So the way you're asking the question is about a skill that you've learned.
Mm,
And that probably is different than apraxia. So
mm,
we don't have a good example of somebody who's learned to say they've learned to hit a tennis ball, or they've learned a surgical skill. Maybe they're dentist and they've learned, how to use the tools associated with that. We don't have good examples that a brain deficit that makes them lose that skill. So probably because that skill is in lots of places, many components of it are there different places. We don't have an example of a single place that makes them lose a specific skill. Apraxia is an example of general loss of ability to, remember the uses for certain kinds of tools, and it's fairly rare conditions. Now, in terms of memory of how you learn to play, say, tennis. Um,
mm,
so the answer is we don't know, but we do know that learning to produce a skill, laboratory type skills, where for example, I'll give you a notion of what one of the things that we've done. So instead of learning to play tennis, what I can do is that I can have a robot So instead of moving a racket, learn to move this robot. You hold the handle of the robot and you move it around, and the robot produces what we call force fields, which are physics basically. You're moving this robot and the robot is generating forces and you're trying to control the action that you're trying to do while the robot is pushing or pulling or moving your arm. So your brain is building some model of this robot because you're controlling this machine. And we know that when there's damage to the cerebellum, they can't do very well in this learning task. They have trouble building models of the physics of this world that they're trying to control. But we don't know so much about how that model is formed and
Mm.
the neural basis of it. We just know that damage to the structure makes it so that they have a hard time doing it.
Okay. I see. I was also talking to Professor Michael Graziano about internal models and attention, and it was so interesting. So this concept of internal models, did it first appear in engineering then, and then it's something that people started using in neuroscience?
Yeah, so many things in neuroscience, particularly with regard to control of movement, first began in engineering because so internal models were important because there's a delay in engineering systems between actions and sensory feedback. So your sensor is going to measure it, but it's going to be with delay. In the brain, it's much slower than in machinery. So, in a sensor that you build, the signals travel at the speed of light because that's how a wire transmits information. But in your brain, the speed is more like the speed of sound. The axons that are allowing the spikes to travel down the axon, they move closer to the speed of sound than the speed of light. So your ability to detect things in your environment through your sensory feedback. When I move my arm, the sensory feedback from my arm is coming to my brain at much slower rate than if I had placed some, sensors that mechanically measured things on my arm. So the concept of internal models seemed to be particularly important for the brain because it had to make predictions simply because its own sensory feedback was so slow. So going back to the example of a shark, the shark has to predict you know, not where the animal is now, but where they're going to go because they're going to have to intercept that trajectory. And therefore it has to have some internal model of, uh, of that animal. And if we were to extrapolate from motion to something like social interaction, I have an internal model of the kind of behaviors I expect from another human being. And so when they deviate from that, oh, that's an error in my model. And I have to, modify my model to better fit what I'm observing.
So when it comes to these predictions, to what extent is the brain also trying to produce the least amount of effort and save the most amount of time? I'm talking to Professor Carl Friston soon, like in on the 4th of June, and we're going to talk about the free energy principle. And it kind of reminds me of what I'm asking you, but I'm really curious to see how these predictions maybe are saving us energy or saving us time.
Control requires good prediction because, if I'm trying to achieve some goal, I need to be
Mhm,
able to understand the consequence of my action. So if I were to produce some action, I need to be able to predict what's it going to do in the long-term goal that I have. If you're playing a game and if you are learning the 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 way your actions, moving some joystick, is going to influence the behavior of some creature that you're controlling, you're building a model that describes the relationship between your actions and their consequences. When you pick up suppose that you have a cup, but suppose that it's opaque, so you can't see how much liquid there's in it. Well, as you go to pick it up, your brain is making predictions of how much liquid there is in this cup. And you can tell because if there's less liquid in there than you expected, your hand's going to go like this, right? So
mhm.
your ability to make these predictions are in display when you interact with this environment. If you put a can of a soft drink in the fridge, and maybe you've drank a quarter of it, and then you put it there, and then you come back tomorrow and you go to pick it up, your brain appears to remember how much liquid there was in there, because if your roommate came and drank half of it, then you know your hand will move up faster than you expect, and you remember these facts about your environment around you. And these are models that our brain just constantly builds about our actions and what we expect about the consequences of those actions.
Can we talk a little bit about the anatomy of the cerebellum? And I always ask my teachers sometimes this question, and I never. I mean, I think just me asking them in my head, I feel I require such a specific answer to be satisfied. And obviously, in science, we don't know exactly the answer to this. But I'm wondering why the anatomical um, position of the cerebellum is where it is. What's the evolutionary benefit of it being in that precise location? I know, and I always ask this about all the organs in the body too, and yeah, I never seem to find an answer that I'm like, okay, this makes sense. I guess it's difficult
But it's a good
to.
question. Like, why is it there? Why not someplace else? It's a very good question. And I, yeah, I don't know enough to give you an answer that satisfies you. Uh, as you know, nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. And you can ask a question about, like, why is it the phrenic nerve that's going to go control our diaphragm leaves the spinal cord way up here, not
Mm,
closer down to the diaphragm. And the answer is that, well, we used to breathe with our gills,
mm,
not with our diaphragm down here. And
mm.
so perhaps, coming back to your question about the cerebellum, why is it there? It must have something to do with the evolutionary history of fishes and their development, I would guess.
Okay, okay. No, that makes sense. Talking more broadly now about the anatomy of the cerebellum, can you talk to us a little bit about its shape, how it looks, the sub parts, just so we start understanding a little bit the anatomy of it too?
Yeah, the cerebellum looks something like a cauliflower. It's this
Mm,
beautiful, um, highly regular shape, folded upon itself. There are 10 lobules in the cerebellum, and it literally means the little brain.
mm,
The uh, the inputs to it come from these two pathways, one called the mossy fibers, the other one's called the climbing fibers. And the mossy fibers, they're basically the rest of the brain. What's happening is information is going to the cerebellum via these mossy fibers. Effectively, the cerebellum is getting information that says, what's happening in the rest of the brain? Tell me. And that's
mm,
coming in the mossy fiber. So, for example, when you're about to do something, when you're thinking about some action, as you're performing a movement, those motor commands, those thoughts, the sensory feedback, all of it is going through the mossy fibers and comes to the cerebellum. Presumably, those inputs are being used by the cerebellum to make predictions that are then going to go out from the nucleus to the rest of the brain, and is going to help whatever computation that's being done elsewhere. Now, those predictions are based on models that the cerebellum builds. And if it's going to learn these models, it has to have an error signal. It has to have some teacher that will tell it when it did something poorly. And that's
mm,
the second input to the cerebellum. It comes from the climbing fibers. And the climbing fibers provide that information that's going to help the cells of the cerebellum improve whatever prediction it was that they're making. And this this climbing fiber input, because it's a teacher, is really interesting to study, because teaching signals are critical for the success of the animal, right? And so you need a good teacher in order to build a good model and make it useful for the the behavior of the animal. So the two inputs are the mossy fibers and the climbing fibers. The mossy fibers are providing information about what is going on in the brain. Tell me what you're doing. The climbing fibers are as sort of a teaching signal that provides information about how good did you send this output that you sent? How good was it? And I'm going to give
Mm.
you feedback on.
And what are the mossy fibers and the climbing fibers made of?
I'm sorry, what are they made of?
Yes.
They're just axons. These are just axons that are coming into the brain, into the cerebellum.
And they have myelin sheaths, and they have
They
the
have
so
myelin sheets. Absolutely.
okay,
Yeah.
so they look like
They
okay,
have
so
myelinated axons that provide the two inputs to the cerebellum. And the output of the cerebellum comes from a region called the deep cerebellar nucleus, the small nuclei that provide in us humans, there are three nuclei that provide the output of the cerebellum. And then there's this gigantic structure of neurons. So in humans, something like 80% of the neurons in your entire brain is in the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is a
mm,
small structure, relatively speaking, but it has 80% of the neurons in the whole brain.
wow. And how does the cerebellum connect with the rest of the brain and the rest of the body? How does it communicate?
So the input comes from the mossy fibers and the climbing fibers, then it gets processed by these neurons in the cerebellum that presumably they look at those inputs and they make predictions, and then the predictions go out of the deep cerebellar nuclei back to the brain. So that goes to the brainstem, it goes to the thalamus, and then that becomes a component of additional information than that the cortex and the brainstem use to perform the action. So if you are planning to make a movement or if you're planning to do something, that process of thinking is informed, gets better because of the inputs from the cerebellum. As I'm moving my eyes, my ability to move my eyes improves because of inputs from the cerebellum. My ability to move my arm improves because I rely on the cerebellum. So the cerebellum by itself doesn't actually do any movement or any thinking. It receives inputs, it adds something to that, and then it sends its output. And then whatever structure in the rest of the brain that's doing the thinking or the moving can do its job better because of the cerebellum.
Interesting. Um, this is a bit of a. I'm just curious. Uh, regarding eye movements, since you mentioned eye movements, I was reading. I don't really remember where I was reading it, but does really rapid eye movements compared to slower eye movements? Um, what does it tell us about the function of our cerebellum and the function of our brain? Does it tell us anything particular?
So there are, roughly speaking, you have two kinds of eye movements we can describe. There's the fast movements, like you said, they're called saccades. So that's when
Mm,
you're like reading a book or scanning an image. Rapid eye movements between
mm,
points of interest. A saccade in us humans is a movement that moves our eyes. It takes about 50, 60, 70 milliseconds for that movement to complete. Extremely rapid eye movements, extremely rapid movements, and probably the fastest movements we make is a saccade. Then there are
mm.
these slower movements. So if you are watching, let's say, a bird fly across the sky, that's called a smooth pursuit. And what you're doing is to pursuing with your eyes a object so that it stays on the fovea, so that the object is remaining on your fovea. You can keep keep that on your fovea by smoothly moving your eyes. And that's also part of um, a reflex that we have. Is called the vestibular ocular reflex. So as I'm moving my head, you notice that my eyes move backwards. So I move my head left, my eye moves to the right. And
Mm.
that's a reflex that I have in my brain that also depends on the cerebellum that makes it so that I can maintain the object that I'm interested in on the center of my attention, which is on my fovea.
Okay, interesting. Um, when it comes to we talked about apraxia. What other issues, what other conditions do we might we see in people that have a lesion in the cerebellum, so kind of damage in the cerebellum?
Yeah, so damage to the cerebellum produces a condition called ataxia, which basically means disorder. Um,
Mhm.
and it reflects this observation that was made by Gordon Holmes. So I'll tell you a little bit about Gordon Holmes. So Gordon Holmes was this neurologist who, um, at the beginning of World War I, in England. He signs up for the duty and he's sent to France. And he treats he treats soldiers who have had damage to their brain. And so World War I was this war that had a lot of shrapnel and things that would fall down on these foxholes where the soldiers were protecting themselves. And the damage that was caused by these bombs that basically would go off was somewhat controlled by the helmets that they wore, but the back of the helmets that they had was open in the case of the British and the American soldiers. So Gordon Holmes, being a neurologist, he gets to see a lot of soldiers with damage to the back of their head. So the back of the head, you have the visual cortex and you have the cerebellum, and he begins documenting what he sees in these soldiers. And what he sees is that basically movements that have disorder, meaning that they make movements, but as they get closer to the goal of the movement becomes jerky. So if I were to like move my hand to my nose, I can easily do it, but a patient doing it might do something like this. So movement begins normally, but then it ends poorly. They also have balance issues. They have slurred speech. So if you've ever drank too much, what you do is that you slur your speech. And what's happening is that alcohol is affecting your cerebellum and you have trouble controlling the mouth and the jaw in order to properly move the air through your facial structure. So Gordon Holmes measures these properties and he says, look, the cerebellum has a lot to do with control of movements. And here are the deficits that I'm seeing in these patients. Now, um, that was called ataxia and some of the disorders associated with the movements. Now, in the years since then, we've learned that damage to the cerebellum doesn't just produce disordered movement, but also disordered thoughts, and meaning that the ability to plan, the ability to control your behavior and your thinking process, that also depends on the cerebellum, because the patients that have damage to cerebellum, they have this disordered thought process. And we know less about that because it's harder to study that in animals, but it appears to be present in people that have had damage to their cerebellum.
Wow, that's so interesting. Um, you know, from what I understand, like we said in the beginning, like you said to us, there's a lot of stuff that we principles, ideas from engineering that we transferred to neuroscience and helps us understand the brain. Has the opposite occurred at all? So have there been any ideas we got from neuroscience and principles we got from neuroscience and then we were able to apply to engineering? I guess it's kind of a bit that bi-directional situation, but I'm just curious.
That's a beautiful question. And yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer for you. I just my own ignorance. I don't know for
Mm.
sure, but um, there's a field in neuroengineering. It's called neurometic engineering, meaning that exactly your question: can we take principles of how biology works and apply that to make better machines? And I I don't know. There certainly must be, but I just don't know that much about it. I'll give you one example where um, I think it inspires people and scientists thinking about it. So the very first uh, neural network and rules for neural networks were based on a concept called the perceptron. So perceptron is it's a very simple neural network that is based on a very simple learning rules. And if one looks at the history of the thought process of why were people interested, why were scientists interested in making a neural-like machine, was because they were interested in understanding how the brain works. But we didn't know how the brain works. So there were mathematicians that were thinking, okay, we've discovered that neurons generate binary signals. And so can we use that information to build a machine that does some kind of information processing? And so the the inspiration for understanding the brain led to things like neural networks, artificial intelligence, algorithms that teach those neural networks. But it often began with the desire to understand how does the actual brain work. And there were simple um, foundational pieces of information that was understood about how neurons work and how they process information. And that was some form of inspiration that led to development of engineering algorithms that became part of, for example, neural networks and AI. But in terms of exact copies, I don't know of any.
Mm. Okay, okay, interesting, interesting. But I like the way I like your answer, to be honest, because I didn't think of artificial networks and artificial intelligence and the link there, and it was kind of in my face, but I didn't make the link. Um, I want to understand some basic terms when it comes to engineering, and it's really cool that I'm able to talk to you because I really like people that are experts in multiple fields because a lot of the time, well, they see how these fields are connected, and um, I said this in another episode, but I really like the preface from what's the book called? I think the book is called "What Is Life," um, and uh, and and in the book, I is it Schrodinger? I think
Schrodinger.
it's Schrodinger, and he says, I'm going to attempt to make a fool of myself and try to apply things I've learned from physics in biology, and I agree. It's such an amazing thing to kind of humble yourself and discover new things. Anyway, but when it comes to optimal control theory and uh, I don't really understand what it means. From what and so I would like to understand what it is. And when it comes to internal models too, perhaps maybe we can break this question into two. I would like to understand kind of at least the basic way internal models work in engineering, and maybe the basic materials we use and stuff like that.
Okay, so you asked about optimal control theory. So let me give you a basic idea. The 20th century, engineering had two fundamental mathematical ideas. One of them was the Coleman explanation for how to make prediction. And the second was the Bellman equations, which described how to solve optimal control problems. So these two are related ideas. So the Bellman equations, Richard Bellman came up with a solution to optimal control problems. And then um, uh, Coleman came up with equations that describe how to make prediction and how to incorporate feedback into your prediction so you can make better integration of these two pieces of information. To me, these were the two pillars of mathematical engineering of the 20th century. So I'll tell you a little bit about the relationship between these things. What are these and what do they have to do with the brain? So optimal control is about the concept of having a long-term goal, but making decisions so that even though I'm very far from my goal, I'm on the right path to achieving my goal. So for example, you can think about a game of tic-tac-toe. You want to win the game. That's your goal. You find yourself at the beginning of the game. Where should you place your O? Where should you place your X? you can think about a game of chess. You can think about it in terms of much more concrete things like I want to get a good grade at this in this course, but I find myself today, what should I study? So the idea is to have a policy that tells you what to do in order to achieve a long-term goal. In a way, what we have in something like the Ten Commandments. So Ten Commandments are a fundamental part of Judeo-Christian way of thinking. Ten Commandments are policies that describe what you should do. Why? In this case, maybe because you want to go to heaven, maybe because you want to live a good life. These are policies that tell you what you should do in order to achieve a long-term goal. The Bellman equations are a way to solve optimal control problems. Optimal control is a problem of saying, I want to achieve a long-term goal that has these costs and these rewards. I want to maximize my reward while minimizing my effort cost. That's one kind of a cost. But I want to do that over the long-term course of some action. And in order to do that, I need policies. Policies tell me what to do at any state in order to get to my final destination with least effort and maximum amount of reward. And Bellman equations give you a way to solve optimal control problems. And if you think about um, so this is sort of, you might think, but this is very far from what the brain does. No, but the brain also is solving optimal control problems all the time because you're making decisions about to do things. Maybe you meet somebody and you think that, oh, maybe this person might be the right person for me. So you have some long-term goal, but then you have to make decisions about minute-to-minute interactions with this individual. Those are the questions about how I should uh, pursue them. That becomes an optimal control problem. Something as simple as let's say, walking. So why is it that we walk this more or less the same way? Why is it that we stand up and then we move our legs in this way? What's good about that? Well, you can think about it from the perspective of a cost as an effort. It has some reward. I want to get to some place. And what's the best way to produce this cost? That becomes an optimal control problem. Reaching movement might be something. Why is it that I move my hand from here to here in this way, not, some other way? Why is it that my shoulder and elbow move in this way? Not, I
Mm.
could also move my hand like this or like this, but I move it like this. So what's good about that? And these are questions that we can ask from a optimal control perspective. And it provides us with policies. Policies tell us what to do at any given time, at any given state in order to achieve this long-term goal the best way possible. Think about tennis. You
Mm.
have a goal of putting the serve at a particular location. But, there are a million ways to move your arm, move the racket, and finding the right way to hit the ball so that it ends up there. So your goal is with the ball and where it should go, but you have to produce this, you have to figure out, all the various ways of moving your arm so that the ball is placed at that location. And that's the problem that optimal control provides you with a solution for. And that's what the Bellman equations do. What does this have to do with the brain? Well, reinforcement learning is a way to solve optimal control problems. How does reinforcement learning work? It relies on this thing called dopamine, which I described to you at the beginning, which is what Wolfram Schultz's work was about, describing, oh, look, dopamine is potentially solving reinforcement learning problems, which is related to optimal control.
Wow, that's fascinating. That was really cool. Um, 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 we're going towards the end of our episode, but I want to learn what you are currently working on. What are your current projects?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I'm working on. So, I am trying to understand learning in the brain, and I'm trying to figure out a puzzle. So, you if you ever take a course on machine learning, you learn that you know Jeff Hinton and his colleagues solved the problem of machine learning using an algorithm called backpropagation. Backpropagation is a way for the teacher to provide error information to every artificial neuron in a correct way. And so what you learn when you take a course like this is that you can't just have an error signal that goes everywhere. each neuron has to have a specific error signal that's relevant to they themselves. So there has to be this special teacher-student relationship. It can't be a general relationship. It has to be specific. So, you know, the way in your classroom, you sit there and the teacher provides you some information, right? Well, that cannot be the way you teach a neural network. Every teacher-student relationship has to be unique to that neuron because the idea is to teach them how to improve their specific output. So the problem I'm working on is that we know how to teach machines and the relationship between the teacher and the student. I mentioned to you that the cerebellum, we know the teacher, that's the climbing fiber. So I'm wondering, like, does the climbing fiber in the cerebellum obey the rules of machine learning? Does it work the same way? And if so, like how? How does it do that? Um, and so I begin with this framework in mathematics that says this is the way a teacher-student relationship should be if it's effective. And then you look in the brain and you say, okay, I think this is the teacher here. This is the axon that brings the teacher information. And here's the student. Here's this neuron is the student. Do they obey that teacher relationship that I expected for machine learning? And if so, how? So that's the puzzle.
Wow, there's a lot of questions that are generated. It's such a fascinating problem. So how do we just understand the basic reason? How do we know that the climbing fibers have that teaching role in the first place?
Good, good. Yeah. So what you do is that you can, of course, record from the climbing fibers and record from the neuron that they innervate, they're called Purkinje cells. And you see that, oh, when the climbing fiber input comes, it induces a change in the synaptic weights of the inputs to the Purkinje cell. They're called parallel fibers. The parallel fibers have some synaptic weights. The climbing fiber comes in, it sends a spike, and then what that does is that it changes the weight of the synaptic input. It makes them, it reduces them. When it's firing above its baseline, it reduces the weight. When it's
Mm.
firing below its baseline, it increases the weight of that input.
So it brings a correct, like a correction, it produces a correct, a better response than the previous one.
Yeah. So it's a teaching signal that provides the neuron, the student, with a guidance on how it should change these weights of its inputs. And
Mm.
machine learning, we know how to do that as well. And so is the student-teacher relationship the same as it is or is that is there something different in biology? And if so, look how effective it is. Look how well it works in me. Perhaps it's the same, perhaps it's different. I don't know. That's the puzzle.
And what about the student? So is the mossy fibers the student in this
So the
case?
mossy fibers come to what are called granule cells. These granule cells are these billions of these tiny neurons that take the input and then they increase the dimensionality of this input. So if the input was, I don't know, a few million mossy fibers, now it becomes a few billion um, neurons, granule cells that send these parallel fibers. And the theory is that what the cerebellum is trying to do is to get information from the rest of the brain and then find connections, correlations between things. So maybe something you saw with something you did with your hand, or maybe a thought or a memory. So you're trying to find patterns and you have to connect things that aren't necessarily even close to each other. And then you see, oh, that's the pattern. And so the idea is that the input is coming from the mossy fibers, but then the granule cells are sparsely sampling it and then asking, is there some pattern here that's repeating? And if so, okay, that pattern must be important for predicting the outcome.
Okay, and so how are you going about to figure out an answer to this?
So I'll give you an example about yourself. So you're in second year medical school. You're learning patterns, right? You're learning that when I see symptom A, symptom B, symptom C, it's
Mm,
likely that it's disease D.
mm,
And so
mm,
that's what your brain is learning. Well,
mm,
in a very simple way, what we think the cerebellum is doing is that now it's instead of symptoms being like three or four, there are millions of things that could possibly be important, and through repetition, repeatedly seeing some pattern, it's learning to say these patterns predict this is going to be what's coming next, and that is the mossy fiber input that becomes the granule cell input to the parallel fibers that goes to the Purkinje cells. It comes the output, and then if the output is wrong, the climbing fibers say, actually, your prediction didn't work. Change these weights. And perhaps this learning is similar to what happens in neural networks. Who knows?
interesting. And so is it that, from what I understand, in neural networks, we mentioned backpropagation, and you said that for each individual, I don't know what the fundamental unit is.
Neuron,
Is
a
it
neuron.
neuron?
Yeah,
Okay, so for each neuron, there's kind of a specialized uh, way of saying correcting a response to
right,
make it better.
right, right.
But and we're trying to see if there's something similar going on when it comes to the climbing fibers when and their teaching role to the cerebellum. Um, so I'm just downloading this in my brain just to process it. Um, so so what are you doing to figure this answer? Are you describe me like how does what are the experiments? What kind of things are you focusing on your academic papers in order to kind of come to a conclusion?
Well, you have to understand the the activities in these neurons and to relate them
Yeah.
to the predictions that the brain is making and the errors that take place, and asking, is the teacher-student relationship following some mathematical representation that you think should
Mm,
be, um, as you would expect in some engineering system. And so, yeah, we work with our animals that we put electrodes in the brain. We record from these neurons. We have them make actions, predictions. We see when they make errors. We see how the teacher is helping them improve their predictions. And then you record from these neurons and ask, what is this teacher-student relationship? Does it make sense? Or is it
mm.
something different?
Interesting. What's the implication of let's say we see that it's very similar to artificial neural networks. What implications does that give us? What questions does it generate after that?
Yeah. So if it's true that it looks like if the mathematics of machine learning indeed are consistent with this teacher-student relationship, then the question is, well, how? How does the teacher know about all the intricacies of the student's individual issues? So to make this comparison, to say how they teach you in medical school. So imagine that your teacher doesn't teach everybody the same thing, but they meet with you and ask you questions, and they stress the parts that you don't know rather than just teaching everybody the same way. And the implication is that the teacher knows the student and knows the weaknesses and strengths of the student and caters the teaching process to their predictions and their outputs. And and if that's the case, if that's the way in the cerebellum the teaching signal works, then the question is, well, how does the climate farmer become so smart to know these things? And how does development make this work? How does the brain solve this kind of problem so that if it has found the right teaching signal and we can make sense of that teaching signal, then the question is, well, how did it find it?
Okay, interesting. Wow, this was a very fascinating conversation. Um, I really, you know, I have my OSCEs, my practical examinations at the end of the month. So I'm doing upper limb, lower limb examinations. I'm doing cranial nerve examinations, shoulder, knee, etc., etc. And then next month I have my theory test for the year, and it really helps to do these podcasts, especially the medicine related ones, because it just sparks more curiosity inside of me, and then it makes studying medicine much more fun. So it's always really, really nice to have these conversations. Um, Before we finish, I wanted to just ask you a couple questions, little less related to your main area of expertise, although they are related. But um, well, one is when it comes to artificial intelligence and its kind of broader I guess, impact in the world. I'm just curious to see how you're viewing the development of AI. Are you excited? Are you scared? Are you kind of unbothered? How do you see things progressing? Again, it's just I'm interesting because you're in the field of neuroscience. You're in the field of engineering, and I'm curious.
You know, the last 2 centuries, we've seen this exponential increase in human productivity. And from the steam engine, to the internal combustion engine, to the development of using electricity, and all along the way, we've seen human productivity increase. And I think that artificial intelligence, it appears to be another milestone where it's going to just tremendously increase human productivity. And now, of course, there are, you know, it's unlike any other technology we've had before because it's eerily intelligent, very human-like, and it appears to be able to do so much of what we thought defined humanity. Um, Sigmund Freud has this beautiful observation that, with every revolutionary new thing, the sense of what makes humans human becomes less and less. Um, and I don't know what is going to be the definition of a human anymore, what makes us special anymore. Um, which I mean, honestly, I like that. I like the humility that comes with the sense that there really may not be anything particularly special about us. So we just accept that we can generate things that make us feel less special and make us understand that whatever it is that we think we can do, we can create things that are almost as good as we can do, perhaps even better in some of it. So I, on the one hand, as I think about it, I think that it just one should celebrate the human brain and all its achievement. And here's another thing that the human brain has made, which are these artificial systems that can equal or better us in some of the things that we do. And yeah, I admire that. I admire that about this incredible thing that sits under my bald head. That I share that with all of us humans. That it's humans that made AI.
That's very that's very beautiful perspective. um, There's two more things I wanted to ask you, closing questions. Um, One, I'm not sure if you want to talk about it at all. I'll leave it for last so I can cut it out if you don't want it in. And the other one is, so, I mean, you've studied the cerebellum and you've studied the brain for many, many years. I wonder, when you're thinking about um, the 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 relationship between movement and the brain, and you compare your perspective of this relationship to maybe another scientist that's not as focused on the cerebellum, or maybe even the kind of more so conventional perspective, if you consider your perspective a little bit more perhaps nuanced in contrast to the conventional. like, where would it differ, if it differs at all? Do you feel like movement is kind of more fundamental than what people think? Do you think the cerebellum has a more fundamental role than what people think when it comes to the brain and us?
You know, I came to the field, as I mentioned to you, from robotics because I thought physics provides us with a way to write the thing that we see using equations. So movements, we can write because we know the physics of movements. We can write it as an equation. We have an input to it. It has an output. It produces motion. So we can write down the problem mathematically. And I think that has attracted me to control of movements because ultimately it's about control of physics, physical objects. And that lends itself to a formalism that can be described mathematically. Um, there are that to me has an advantage just from the
Mm,
perspective of being able to describe the problem in that way. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's interesting or even important. It just means that it's
mm,
tractable because of its
mm.
reliance on physics.
That makes sense. But sorry, I have this really bad habit that questions keep popping in my head. I'll keep it sure. But just to make sure, I don't misunderstand. So when it comes to visual input and auditory input, are those things, like, is the visual input primarily just in the visual cortex deals with it, or do we also have predictions from the cerebellum that deal with the visual and the auditory information?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to the problem of uh, uh, predicting prey, where it's going to go. So you visually
Mm,
see the state of the prey, but you have to
mm,
predict its location. But it's not enough just to predict. You have to move in that direction. You have to
mm,
position your body. You have to coordinate your muscles so that the jaw opens at the right time and you can bite and not at the same time be breathing while you are biting. And so all of these things have to be coordinated. And yeah, the sensory information coming to the cerebellum. Similarly with auditory information, it used to be we used to have cell phones, and sometimes you have it also with internet connection where there's a delay, and it's impossible to talk to somebody if there's a 150 millisecond delay in the auditory feedback because we can't function when the feedback that we expect is coming just a few hundred milliseconds after it does.
mm.
It becomes really difficult to communicate. And it
Yeah.
tells you how much we rely on our ability to expect things at the right time.
Mm. It reminds me of because I play the piano, and when I first came to the UK from Cyprus, because Cyprus is my home country, I bought this nice keyboard, but I didn't I didn't have any good speakers to attach it to. So I attached them to this really old laptop I had at the time, and there was a good maybe 100, 200 millisecond delay. It was impossible to play the piano because every time I was playing, especially I was playing something fast, because every time I was playing a note, and the next the note before was the thing I was hearing, and so it made it impossible. Um,
Right.
the last thing I wanted to ask you is, well, I'm aware you're in a very um unique position because, well, you are, I don't know exactly your origin, but I know you have half Iranian, half from the US, if I'm understanding correctly. And so I just wanted to see how you're feeling and what your thoughts are on the current conflict. Again, if you don't want to talk about this, I can always cut it out. I was just curious because you're in a very unique kind of situation in terms of your perspective. So I was curious.
Yeah. Well, I was born in Iran and raised in America. You're right. It puts you in a uncomfortable position that here we have uh, as an immigrant. Who are you? And it's interesting. It's complicated, right? So I feel that I am um, a mosaic of things. I'll give you an example. So Yo-Yo Ma, a famous cellist, which is probably one of the best cellists in the world. So Yo-Yo Ma was born to Chinese parents. He was born in France and then he comes to the United States. And so he has an interview with him, and and they ask him, so what do you relate to? You know, are you Chinese? Are you French? Are you American? And he describes this puzzle in himself as well. So he says that, you know, I was born to Chinese parents. So, you know, there's all that Chinese history and culture. And then I was born in France, which has all these fabulous arts and devotion to creativity. And then came to America, and you have this sense of entrepreneurship. And he says that, you know, you realize that you don't have to be one thing. You can be a combination of things. You can sort of pick the best things from each of these elements that you're exposed to, and that's who you are. And I also feel that that richness allows you to have a more complex life and a more nuanced view of the world. And it's better to be that way. And in some ways, I think that's my sciences as well. Like, you know, I like mathematics, but I also like neurons. So I try to put them together. You don't have to be just one thing.
100%. I feel the same. I feel the same also when it comes to, I mean, funnily enough, because it's kind of, well, people, well, I was going to say religions, because but on the one hand, you know, you can't consider yourself a Christian, also a Buddhist, but, well, I'm in a situation where I zoom out quite a bit from religions, and I kind of see, okay, what are the teachings of this religion? I like studying religious texts. I'm going to have some upcoming podcasts on different, especially philosophy or religion. I'm going to have a few podcasts on. And so there's a lot of lessons to learn from different religions. And I think it's quite limiting when people just, you know, I mean, especially this is quite common. Sometimes I go to church with my housemate, and, well, there's some people that really like studying other religions. There's people that, you know, have a very strong thing against doing that. Like, you're studying different religions. Like, they feel like it's some kind of bad thing to do, and it's very common. And it's not. I didn't know it would be common until, you know, there's a this project, and I live in Brighton in the UK, and there's this course that runs every few months in one of the churches, and it's supposed to be kind of, well, a lot of people come from different religious backgrounds, and then they kind of talk to each other, and they try to exchange ideas. And I went there, I was so excited, and by the end of it, I annoyed everyone, because I was asking a lot of questions and annoyed a lot of people. And I mean, I did it with the purest of good intentions, but I realize, oh God, it's hard to kind of, a lot of people identify very strongly with one thing. It's hard to kind of, like you said, pick and choose things from different things. Anyway, sorry, I'm just rambling, but I just found kind of a correlation to what you were saying. Thank you so much for the conversation, Professor. It was awesome. I really enjoyed it. I hope I didn't bore you with silly questions. I will send you the podcast once it's out. Yeah, we're all done. Let me know if there's anything else you want to talk about. Otherwise, we're all done.
Wonderful. I had a great pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much, sir. All the best.